Laura, good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing well. I mean, as well as can be expected these days.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's a loaded statement. How about where are you?
Right this very minute, I am in New Orleans, which is where I'm from. I taught at Loyola University, New Orleans for 10 years. So this is
Oh,
and I also grew up down here. So this is my home base.
I don't meet a lot. I don't meet a lot of folks from New Orleans. That is,
We try to keep
what's
this
what's
secret.
it like living in New Orleans?
It's perfect bliss. It's great. I love New
Is it?
Orleans. Yeah, growing up, I really thought that I wanted to leave desperately. I felt like there wasn't enough of an intellectual vibe here, and that if you wanted to be educated, you need to get out of here. I sort of had inherited, adopted the outsider's view of what the South is like. So I ran away as fast as I could, and then longed to come back as all the time. So when I got a job at Loyola, I was psyched. So I came back here 2010, I guess.
Well, you've done a lot on your sojourning around the world. We're going to talk quite a bit about that. You're mostly known on the internets around UFLPA enforcement, the evolution of it, a big part of it. I know you're going to talk. We're going to talk quite a bit about it today. For our listeners, I'm just wondering if you can explain for our audience what the UFLPA is and why it's so important for U.S. importers to understand.
Sure, yeah. So the UFLPA is the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It was passed by Congress in December of 2021, went into effect in June of 2022. And essentially, it responds to a major crisis in China, and that is that there is a genocide going on there, and a sort of the epicenter of that genocide at this point. Previously, there were hundreds of internment camps. So a lot of those internment camps have closed. 1 million people were in it at their height. 600,000 people have been moved to mass arbitrary detention in prisons now. But the epicenter of that genocide, of the work to separate families, to end people's culture, to forcibly transport people, is in factories and farms. It's in a system of forced labor implemented by the state. It's created by the state. It's enforced by the state. People get visited by the government. They knock on their door and they say, "We'd like you or your daughter, your teenage daughter, to go work in a factory somewhere." And you don't really have a choice because it's all operating on the backdrop of this system of mass arbitrary detention. And so Congress said, this is a situation that is beyond the pale. It is systematic and it's across the entire region. It's something that we can't really address because we can't go in and really work with workers there and try to change the system because it's imposed by the state. And so what do we do about it? How do we address it? Well, we refuse to import those goods. And so recognizing the situation as being as grievous as it is, Congress then said, we're going to ban the import of any goods made in that region at all. And they were right to do so. The situation of forced labor in the Uyghur region is pervasive. It is inescapable. It's unauditable. You can't go down there and try to work with a single factory to try to change it. It's irremediable at this point. So the U.S. government protects consumers and businesses from buying the goods made in Xinjiang by banning the import of them. And so since June of 2022, goods that are made in whole or in part in the Uyghur region of China are stopped, are detained by CBP. If CBP detects that the product is made in whole or in part in Xinjiang, in the Uyghur region, then they stop it, and the company has to prove to the government that that product was not made in Xinjiang or that it was not made with forced labor. Those are their two choices. Or they can re-export that good and sell that good that's suspected of being made with forced labor to someone else in some other country. And so that kind of, in short, there are lots of little pieces and parts, but the basic premise is that the U.S. government presumes that if a product was made in Xinjiang, it was made with forced labor.
What an interesting time. So this got passed got passed a little bit longer, but started being implemented a few years ago. I remember years ago, doing some work with the Obama administration around um, consumer awareness around forced labor and supply chains with a project I did with them called Slavery Footprint. And
Right.
that caught so many consumers' attention. It kind of caught a moment of
Yeah.
awareness that
Yeah.
the administration said, "Hey, the president wants to do an executive order, something meaningful, and what do you think about doing um, uh, fixing a loophole in a 1930s tariff act?" I'm like, that sounds like a nothing burger. Why? Why? I don't even understand what a tariff act is. I mean, we all
Right.
understand tariff acts now, don't we? But
Yeah.
that was the Smoot-Hawley tariff act that
Mhm.
in that act, uh, and we should be talking about that time and this time today, because there's just some real interesting parallels of what's going
Yeah.
on, right? But this was 12 years ago or something like that. It just, no one was thinking about tariffs or import bans, but there was a loophole in that act that allowed for the importation of slave-made goods if it couldn't be produced domestically. What a
Right.
weird loophole.
Right. And we had
Eh,
any excuse. If it just we couldn't make enough of it. If we kind of wanted it a little bit. We kind of like then you could go ahead and bring it in. And so basically
oh,
nothing stopped, right? Because we for 100 years the United States has had a law that banned the import of forced labor made goods. 100 years.
yeah,
That's it's just five shy, right? So since 1930, we're the only country to have that law. It's really
it's amazing.
surprising to me. And so but we never really enforced it until
Yeah, yeah,
2016. Until that thing where we said, well, but if we kind of want it, we're going to go ahead and bring in
yeah,
these slavery
right.
goods anyway.
The fact that it was there at all, sometimes it's easier to say the sky is falling and stuff like that's noble and good and beautiful and noteworthy. And sure, there was a loophole, but like people were thinking about these things 100 years ago
Yeah.
at some level, and now we're thinking about them again. And it was the closing of that loophole that allowed for the UFLPA to come about. So there's a lot to celebrate
Yeah.
in we're Americans. We have an international audience, and I know America's making a lot of news right now when it comes to tariffs and all that. But like in the midst of all the chaos, there's things like that to celebrate, and it allowed for this act to be created, which has really stirred up trade. So maybe can you talk about how the UFLPA, since it's been passed, how it's been enforced, and kind of what impact that's had on business?
So I have a piece coming out sometime in the next week. I'm not exactly sure when, but a piece on what I think the impact of the UFLPA is. And
Mm,
I think it's enormous, honestly. I'm
mm,
biased. I've had a great, the role in advocating for the UFLPA and working with Department of Homeland Security, which I'm sure we'll talk about, in implementing the UFLPA. And so I admit that I'm a little bit biased, but I'm also obsessed in a way that almost no one else is about whether it's working, what it's doing, who's doing it now, like who's complying, who's not complying. So I'm in a position, I think, an unusual position, not necessarily unique, but an unusually nerding out, obsessed position to assess how it's going. And I'll say that just right off the top, we should be doing better. The UFLPA has enormous powers attached to it, and we are able, by law, we have the authority to stop tons more goods that are made with forced labor, and we should be. However, that said, I think we've done a lot in 3 years. I think we've, first of all, now that I've worked in government, I realize just how hard it is to stand up office to and to train officers like customs officers to really figure out how to detect forced labor, to figure out how to stop things. What are the protocols? What's the paperwork look like? What do you want to receive from a company when you stop
yeah.
their goods? Do you really want to see everything in their entire supply chain? When they first said we want to see everything for every supply chain, I said, you're mad. Like, where are you going to have the computer center to hold all this data?
Right.
This is significant what you're asking for. So like just figuring out how to train people. Forced labor, you can't sniff it like you can sniff drugs,
No,
right?
no,
You can't.
there's no emission. No.
Right. There's no X-ray technology to see,
Right.
oh, is this product made with forced labor or not? So like training people to really trace supply chains, to be able to identify when companies are telling you the truth about what's in their supply chain and when they're not telling you the truth about what's in their supply chain, about what paperwork they need to be able to prove it. All these things take time. And I want things to happen overnight, right? And in government time, this thing did happen overnight. You know, what CBP did, what Customs and Border Protection did to be able to equip themselves to identify forced labor made goods from the Uyghur region in imports coming into the United States was they took the experts they already had. They said, look, we have people who are working on counterfeits, who know apparel supply chains. We are counterfeits who know drug supply chains, pharmaceutical supply chains. We have people who are working on tariffs and dumping, who know metals and automotive supply chains and these kinds of things. And so let's get them to figure out what do they know that could be applied to, you know, if you put on your UFLPA glasses, how do you see these violations in the imports that come in? And so they leaned on that, but they also built up new technology. They're opening new isotopic testing labs.
Wow.
They're, you know, they've hired a lot of new people to work on the UFLPA entity list, which was the office I worked in, where they find the worst of the worst, the companies that are absolutely using forced labor or sourcing from the Uyghur region, and they put them on this list where they individually, those companies are not allowed to import in, or or their goods are not allowed to be imported in if they're made in whole or in part by those companies even. And so, so it was a lot of work, and they're growing, they're developing all the time, right? It didn't happen overnight. It happened overnight in government time in some ways, but they put the resources, they put the political will behind making it happen, and it works. CBP has stopped. It's like $3.7 billion worth of goods as of right now. They've stopped goods.
Roughly 16,000 shipments.
Yeah, yesterday I looked up. It's like 16,755, I think. It's something like.
You said you're passionate, so
yeah, I am, and I just happened to look it up yesterday. But it's it's a lot of shipments. It's not enough. There are 144 companies on this entity list. There could be thousands.
Let's talk about that. Let's talk about that, because I don't think I meet companies every day who know what the UFLPA is roughly, but they don't really know how the mechanisms work. And I'd like to start with, what are how does a company end up on this list, and how does, and maybe we can talk about why, not just how, but why and how does a company end up on this entity list that you can't purchase from, correct?
Yeah.
Anywhere in the supply chain.
Right.
And then how do we get some of these products? I think we had this week or last week, new products were added, like lithium and caustic soda. I don't drink soda, so I don't really know what caustic soda is. I probably shouldn't drink that soda either.
Don't drink caustic soda.
Okay. Yeah. So, but yeah, maybe you can talk about how these random items fall into this list.
But let's start with the entity list, and then we'll talk about the high priority sectors. The entity list gives the U.S. government's Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force. They call it the FLETF. There's an abbreviation for everything, right? So the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force has the authority to name individual companies to this entity list that they think, that they have reason to believe, they have evidence to show is that are either using forced labor, transferring people from Xinjiang to factories, or essentially sourcing the goods from Xinjiang to export. Okay. And so what happens is, there's a ton of civil society and academic research, including the stuff that I do as a researcher, that informs the government about companies that might be relevant to that list and that are using either Uyghur forced labor or buying Uyghur forced labor made goods. And then they do their own research. The U.S. government does their own research to figure out, does it meet the statutory requirements? Is this a company that we believe, and that an army of lawyers, I mean, literally 30 lawyers look over every one of these things and says, Each one of them comes in and says, we need more evidence like this. We need you to state this. This is an inference. Can you give us evidence for that? And they really go through it very rigorously. And then 7 separate agencies vote whether they want to add a company to the list. 7 agencies. Wow. And so this is right. So there's no entity, no company that's added to that list that doesn't undergo an extreme amount of scrutiny.
We all complain about government all the time, but this is something that government can do that can really improve the state of the world, that is very practical in using market forces as to do something that governments can't do outside of their own jurisdiction. I think it's very powerful. No one, a lot of people don't like it. Help me understand, if I'm not directly buying from this banned entity that's on this list, how am I responsible if there's somewhere in the supply chain? Explain the responsibility of that part of it, because I think there's some confusion of like, well, we looked at our invoices and we didn't see any of those names, so we're good. And I hear that a lot.
Right. I think that for a long time, companies have been able to have extremely opaque supply chains and have benefited from that. They didn't have to look at what was happening at the far ends of their supply chains. Their first tier suppliers almost certainly are not using forced labor. There are some first tier suppliers that are, but some their end manufacturers are probably not the ones using forced labor, but way down the supply chain in the mines and the factories, the textile factories and the farms, there's a lot more forced labor, and we all know that. But for decades now, companies have been able to expand their international network of suppliers without having any acknowledgement of what happens at the farthest ends of it. Mm-hmm. And so what the UFLPA has done, and to some extent, the Tariff Act, enforcement since 2016, it's made companies realize that they need to know their supply chains better, that the first tier is not enough. And that the US government and increasingly other governments are going to hold them accountable for what happens down their supply chains. And they're not going to be able to sell to consumers goods that are made with forced labor and just turn a blind eye to it anymore. That's not allowable anymore.
When we hear the word genocide, that's an electric word. And I love that. I don't know if Stalin actually, there's not a lot of Stalin quotes I'm excited about. But the quote about the death of 1 million is a statistic and the death of one is a tragedy. Mm-hmm. We don't emotionally act on statistics. We something triggers inside of us when we hear a story. So we hear genocide. It's like, oh, that sounds terrible. How can that be happening today? Explain a little bit more about what we're talking about in the lives of the people who are being affected here, because most people in America will never meet a Uyghur.
10 years ago, if I talked about, having lived in the Uyghur region, lived in Xinjiang, talk about Uyghur life, Uyghur culture, Uyghur history, people would students, shake their head. Regular people on the streets would say, where is that? I don't know what you're talking about. And now, sadly, because of this horrific situation, people do know about the Uyghur people. They know more about Uyghur culture. They may be eating Uyghur food if they live in a big city. They know about China's repression of the Uyghurs. And you're right that the word genocide is a tough one. It's a complicated one because I think we have a sort of colloquial idea that genocide requires mass extermination, right? But even in Germany, that mass extermination only happened in the last few years of the genocide that happened during the Holocaust. Mm-hmm. And the definition of the legal definition, the international sort of human rights definition of genocide doesn't require that physical extermination of a people. It can be the intent to destroy people in whole or in part, a people in whole or in part. And that destruction can happen by erasing their lives, their livelihoods, their culture. And this is where forced labor is really interesting, as an epicenter, as I said, an epicenter for what's going on there. What they're doing is they're like I said, going door to door to people and saying every single person in this house who is able to work must be working. And the state gets to decide where and how you work. And so if you're like, well, I've got this farm, the government says, that's cool. We're going to take over your farm anyway, because we want to make mass large scale farms out of this. We want to make corporate farms out of this land. We don't want small scale farms. We don't want subsistence farmers. We don't want you to be, we don't want you to be a farmer, period. We want you to be working in a factory. So don't worry. We've got your farm. We've got it taken care of. No worries. And then they say, and there are examples where like this story plays out just like this. Well, the thing is, we've got kids. And, we don't want to go to some distant place or even someplace like only a few miles away because I want to stay home and raise my kids. Don't worry. We got you. We've built all these boarding schools, put 1 million kids. There are only 12 million Uyghur people in China. 1 million kids are in boarding schools right now. It is mandatory for middle-aged children in the Uyghur region alone to go to boarding school. What does this mean? These kids are not allowed to grow up with their parents. They're not allowed to speak their language. At their boarding school, they're only allowed to speak Chinese. They're not allowed to speak Uyghur. And the parents, they say, well, I've got this elder. I've got this mom, grandpa. He's sickly. I got to take care of him. Don't worry. We got you. We've got a elder care facility. And we're going to put your parents and your grandparents in there. And so now people are, and this is a quote, liberated to work. They are unburdened from their families and commitments and cultures to go and be somewhere else. So it's forced family separation, it's forced migration, all these hallmarks of genocide. But even if, and I want to say this and I'll let it go first after that, let's say genocide, that word is a bridge too far for you. How about crimes against humanity? It's patently, without doubt, crimes against humanity. And so sometimes I think let's just not use the word genocide. That's fine.
Evil may not repeat, but it does rhyme. And when you start matching up slogans with freedom and work, I think we've seen that before.
Yeah. There are banners in these factories that say things like that, like work will liberate you. And it's when you see them, it's shocking. It's like you catch your breath because it is such. And when they first started building the internment camps, they called them concentrated camps. And like they would have big signs. It would be like number 4 concentrated camp. And we were just like, did no one vet these phrases? Did you not think for a second about what's going on? You're saying the quiet part out loud here. It's really gruesome.
Oh, so maybe you can explain. I don't think people understand.
Yeah.
A lot of people listening don't understand that this exists, that people shell out their citizens and collect money for the state. Can you explain that a little bit?
So in this case, you might be transferred to a factory that's just down the road, or you might be transferred to a factory that is thousands of miles away from home. And the basic idea is that they want everyone in a job, absolutely every single person in a job. And people in China, there's real significant racism against Uyghur people. And this is part of what fuels this system. But people think that Uyghur people are lazy. They think that they're convinced by Islam that they will be that they don't need to work in this life, that they'll be rewarded in the next. They have this like completely bananas idea about what it means to be Uyghur, really racist, and it's not borne out by the facts. There is significant poverty in the Uyghur region, but it's not for lack of working.
I mean, don't we all doesn't every country have like this group or that group? You hear it, you see the rolled eyes. Obviously, the state doesn't get involved in as many of the, but we do have this embedded, like that group over there isn't as good as this group. Yeah. It's just in this case, the state acted on it. And I think it's significant to understand. So tell me if I have this right, just for people to understand. I'm Justin. I work at Freedom. I work in the Bay Area. What you're saying is if I was working there, they could come along and go, actually, we don't want you in the Bay Area anymore. We're going to send you to Seattle, and you're no longer going to be a CEO. You're going to be working, in accounting or whatever. And your family's not coming with you, and we're not going to tell you when you get to go back. Is that what I'm living with? If that's
That's right. And typically it's for people who are farmers,
Yeah,
who are
that's
impoverished,
yeah.
right? So when the camp, when there were internment camps, there were people who were dentists and teachers who were working as seamstresses in the internment camps, and that's happening in the prisons now too, right? But the labor transfer program is directed at it's called a poverty alleviation program,
Of course.
and if in fact everyone consented to this, it could be a really transformational social
Yeah.
services program.
So on the theme of saying the quiet part out loud,
Mm-hmm.
why care as Americans? This sounds like an over there problem. And there's over there problems everywhere. Why? You said something that to protect consumers. That
Mm-hmm.
sounds grandiose. We're protecting consumers by getting involved in the lives of Muslims in China?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
So I would like to think that we all care very much about the lives of people all over the world. I care about people that I don't know, groups of people I've never heard of, places I've never been. I care about all those folks, and I care very deeply about the way. I actually care very deeply about the way the goods I buy affect people's lives who I'll never meet. That matters to me deeply, and I would like it if everybody were that way, but that's not really the case. That's not always the case. But I do believe that most consumers would like to believe that their products are not made with forced labor. And they would also like it to be someone else's job to figure it out.
Yeah.
And right? And that's fair enough.
They
We
can't
all
figure
have,
it out.
they
They
can't.
can't
It's
figure it out.
look,
Yeah,
I
there's
do this for
nothing.
a living.
So I've been chasing this idea for 15 years. Most people are good,
Yeah.
and most people don't want the toil of their labor to be spent on exploitative labor for someone
Yeah.
else. No one
Yeah.
would. Most people would not tolerate if they could see that happen. The problem is they can't see it,
Yeah.
and why. And the reason the UFLPA is so important for that value. No, it's not. And by the way, it's not an American value. It's it's
So,
absolutely global. And I would argue it's global in China as well. I don't think this is a national value of not wanting people to be exploited. This is a human thing. There is no perfect supply chain. There is no perfect purchase, but they
right.
are getting better. And
Yeah.
maybe you can talk about, before we talk about globally, talk about the successes around the solar industry and aluminum and all these different industries that have had a real impact because of these bans coming out of from the UFLPA.
The UFLPA and some enforcement of the 1930 Tariff Act actually early on meant that the solar industry had to respond at the time and respond by shifting their supply chain significantly because they were so embedded in Xinjiang. At the time, everyone said, "That's it. We're not going to be able to meet our climate goals in the United States. We've completely thrown our hopes out of the window of doing what we need to do in terms of solar installations in the United States. And human rights is the impediment. And we here you are, Laura, you're pitting human rights against the fate of the planet." And at the time, I was really concerned. But one of the things I kept saying was like, who is it that we're saving the planet for?
Say that again. We're not saving the planet for the people who work the hardest.
Yeah, I think that we neglect them, at least when we look at whose land we co-opt to advance our climate goals. Who gets polluted, who gets a say in how these things work. But I have good news for you, and that is that despite all these dire predictions that paying attention to human rights would completely crush all of our ambitions for addressing the climate crisis, we in fact are moving towards our climate goals faster than even the most optimistic person in 2020 would have ever predicted. We are producing more modules. We are installing more modules. We're moving more quickly. We've got a more diverse supply chain. We've got more countries moving into the production from soup to nuts of the whole supply chain.
Directly tied to UFLPA and addressing the solar industry or solar production out of Xinjiang.
Yeah. And this is because everyone said, look, we are not going to buy solar modules anymore that were made with polysilicon or anything from the Uyghur region. And CBP enforced against it. CBP really held the solar industry to this rule. And so, and more than any other industry. And, there might be some complaints about that. Like, what about everybody else? And I do think CBP needs to be enforcing against other industries because we can see what success it is when they actually enforce.
That's right. Yeah. Celebrate the wins. Absolutely. It's a great story. It's a great story that started with protecting people and ended up with an industry flourishing. And I think that we don't have enough of those stories, or we don't have the imagination to recognize that when you protect those who are working in supply chains, you are moving towards flourishing for people and for companies. That's not just a slogan. That's a case study.
Well, and back to what you were saying about like, oh, this is human rights. And I like to remind people that this is about human rights. The top of the UFLPA, where it says like what kind of law it is, it says human rights. It doesn't say trade. Right? It doesn't say it's a trade law. It says human rights. But it is also about leveling the playing field for legitimate business. What was happening in Xinjiang was not only that they were using forced labor, but there were massive state subsidies. There was no environmental protections. They were using coal energy to make green energy. All these things artificially deflate the price of goods in a way that harms American businesses. It harms European businesses. We've seen European, Korean, other companies go under because the Chinese government has made it so that they allow oversupply. The Chinese government has made it so that the price of solar panels, for instance, is so low that no one can actually compete. The price is below the production price.
And so I love that.
Yeah.
I think that is something that every listener needs to understand, that two things can be true at one time. Something can be fair from a market's perspective and right from a human rights perspective at the same time.
At the same time.
We saw this with the Trump administration and some of the appointees coming in, and many of them, as you know, were big behind the UFLPA and proponents of it, Rubio and others. And we've also, you'd hear even I believe J.D. Vance, I'd have to, don't quote me on this, but just like the way that he would talk about this is unfair.
I think we need a carrot and a stick, though. I think one of the things that's really important is that the UFLPA is it's a bludgeon. It is a really hard stick. Yeah. But with the IRA we had, and this is an important piece of this puzzle, it wasn't just the UFLPA did it. The IRA gave, the Inflation Reduction Act gave businesses incentives to move business to the United States. So we saw European companies that were being shuttered because they did not have incentives and they were competing against China, move to start building supply chains in the United States. And so what we need is a situation where we have both pieces of that puzzle. 100%. And I worry that we're taking apart the carrots for business to continue doing work. And if we do that, we're going to find that the stick isn't enough. And I think that that's happening in Europe. And so we can move to your global thing. I think we've got, a sea change happening in the new forced labor regulation, the corporate sustainability due diligence directive, CS-DDD. These things are a part of this sea change I'm talking about. But one, I think corporate lobbyists are trying to get them to water that down and not have much teeth. And that really, it's not going to do the work that it needs to do to level the playing field. If it works that way, we're going to have. It's troubling. But I do see this shift happening. But I think that what governments and businesses need to understand is that robust enforcement levels the playing field among your importers, right? It means if we're right? It means that you all know what you're getting into. You all know what what you have to address. And it means that if you do right by your supply chain and by your customers, by shifting your supply chains, you know that your competitors are going to do the same. And so we want robust enforcement to happen so that it's fair for those who do the right thing.
And it sounds like we want, based on current events, we want robust enforcement universally across different purchasing markets. There was a story just came out about how the UK is now a dumping ground for goods coming out of Xinjiang. And I haven't dug too deep into that, regardless of how much of that is true. It sounds like a great headline. I know that Europe is moving towards a forced labor ban in and of itself. And so give us like 3 steps that companies can start to take right now. They don't have to work overnight, but like, what should they be not thinking about, but what should they be doing right now when it comes to their supply chains?
Yeah, the most important thing is don't wait. Do not wait. You don't want to. You don't want to show up with your goods and have it stopped. It's expensive. Yeah. It's painful. The paperwork is gnarly. You have a short window of period to put it together. You don't wait.
Second, don't wait to do what?
Don't wait. And don't wait to number 2, take a risk-based approach, right? Like, sit down with the Department of Labor's list of goods made with child and forced labor. Look and see which of the products on that list are in your supply chain or part of what you make, are things that you're selling, and see where are the worst forms of forced labor. Talk to somebody if you need to who understands forced labor. Where are the worst forms of forced labor occurring, and where is my highest risk? That you want to. I don't think we need to look. You can't. If you make a solar panel, it's easy. There's only a couple things that go into a solar panel.
Yep.
But if you make a car, you got 30,000 parts. And I did a study of tracing automotive supply chains. It was horrible. It's really hard. But you need a team in place. So the third thing is get a team in place. Have experts that you actually empower to do this work, to see, like, once you've identified the risks, for them to really dig deep. And don't just ask for declarations from your suppliers. That's not going to be enough anymore. The world has changed. You need to actually know what's going on in those factories, and you need to know deeper than your first and second tier. So mapping these things out, but really empowering the people in your compliance team and in your sourcing team to do this well. Because a lot of times you might hire somebody, but they don't actually get to have C-suite attention. They don't really get to. Yeah,
that's it. I was going to say, what is your message to the C-suite for these departments? Because they can very easily become disempowered in a procurement team or a compliance team and just become an accessory. Laura, you are such a, I don't want to embarrass you, but like, you're a historic figure in this time, in this era. You have chosen to take all of your smarts and point them towards the lives of people, most of whom you'll never meet. So as far as I'm concerned, that's historic. What are you working on next? What can we expect next in the line of hits from Laura Murphy?
Actually, I'm really interested in this international advocacy for forced labor import bans. And so a lot of what I'm thinking about, what I wanted to do if I was a political appointee. And so when Biden left, I left. That's how my job was always set up. But if we had stayed for another 4 years, my plan was to work on figuring out how to make, to encourage other countries to adopt these kinds of laws and to create a harmonized system where we're doing the best we can across very different jurisdictions to encourage companies to do the right thing.
Laura, thank you so much. I've wanted to do this conversation for so long, and I think that you make very complex, very difficult things just very palatable. And honestly, you've inspired me, and I know that anyone listening to this, they're going to feel the same. So thank you so much for coming on.